For over 1,200 years, the Norse peoples shaped the fate of an entire continent. They struck from the sea, disappeared before armies could respond, and left kingdoms unable to stop them. Monks recorded their arrival as if the world itself were ending. Kings paid them not to attack, and by the time anyone figured out how to fight back, they had already changed the shape of Europe forever. But why were they so hard to beat? It wasn't just brutality. Plenty of brutal armies got crushed throughout history. There was something else going on, something built into how they moved, how they fought, and how they thought about war itself. Their story starts on the coastlines of Scandinavia in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. Rocky land, short growing seasons, and a coastline that touched nearly everything. If you wanted to survive there, you had to master two things: the sea and how to build something that could cross it. Long before the raids that made them famous, these were already a seafaring people, and that foundation is what made everything after it possible. And that is exactly where their advantage began. The longship. Shallow enough to sail up rivers most armies couldn't reach, fast enough to outrun anything sent after it, light enough to be dragged overland between waterways when the water ran out. No kingdom in Europe had anything like it. While other armies were tied to roads and bridges, the Norse simply went around them, appearing from directions nobody was watching. That single piece of technology rewrote the rules of war. A monastery on an island was supposed to be safe. A town up a river far from the coast was supposed to be safe. Nothing was safe anymore because the sea was no longer a wall, it was a road. Then came the strategy that made them even harder to stop. They refused to fight fair. Most armies in Europe wanted the big battle, two forces lining up in a field deciding everything in a single afternoon. The Norse raiders looked at that idea and ignored it completely. Why fight an army when you could hit a target with no army there at all? They struck monasteries first, and for a brutal practical reason. Monasteries were wealthy, poorly defended, and full of gold, silver, and things worth stealing. A force could land at dawn, take everything of value, and be back on the water before a single soldier arrived. By the time word reached anyone who could fight, the ships were gone. And this is where the fear really took hold. It wasn't only what they took, it was that no one could predict where they'd hit next. A kingdom might spend everything defending its capital, only to learn the attack had landed 100 miles up an unguarded river. Defending against them meant defending everywhere, all the time, which was, in practice, impossible. But raiding alone doesn't explain over 1,000 years of Norse influence. Raiders get old, raiders get killed. What kept this culture dangerous for generation after generation was something less obvious. They weren't just warriors. They were settlers, traders, and opportunists all at once, and they shifted between those roles as the situation demanded. If a kingdom was weak, they raided it. If a kingdom was strong but profitable, they traded with it. If land was empty and worth keeping, they settled it and stayed. This flexibility meant they were never locked into one strategy long enough for an enemy to counter it. You could win a battle against them and still lose the war because the ones you didn't kill would simply come back next spring, or buy the land you were defending, or marry into the family that ruled it. By the 9th century, they weren't only raiding England, they were carving out kingdoms inside it. The Danelaw, a stretch of territory across eastern England, wasn't stolen in a single invasion. It was the result of decades of pressure, until entire regions were simply Norse in law and custom. The same pattern played out in parts of Ireland, and in northern France, where an entire region was eventually handed over and still carries their name today: Normandy, land of the Northmen. And there was one more advantage nobody in Europe expected. Their warrior culture didn't treat death in battle as a tragedy to avoid, it treated it as an honor to earn. A warrior who died fighting believed he was walking straight into a hall of glory, not into an ending. That belief changed how they fought. An army that fears death hesitates, an army that welcomes it does not. Their enemies noticed. Chronicles from the period describe them with a kind of horrified awe, men who fought as if death held no weight at all. Whether every warrior truly believed this or whether it was partly reputation and performance almost didn't matter. Either way, it worked. Fear was its own weapon, and they understood that better than almost anyone fighting them. So how did it finally end? Not with one battle and not with one king. It ended slowly over generations. European kingdoms started building real navies of their own. They fortified towns instead of leaving them open. They learned to respond fast instead of waiting for the damage to be counted. And the Norse themselves changed too, converting to Christianity, settling permanently, marrying into the kingdoms they once raided, until the line between Viking and European quietly disappeared. The last real Viking invasion of England came in 1066, when King Harald Hardrada crossed the sea one final time. He was defeated at Stamford Bridge, just weeks before an entirely different invasion from Normandy changed England forever. Fittingly, the men who conquered England that year were themselves descendants of Norsemen who had settled in France generations earlier. Their story didn't end there either. Norse-descended dynasties, customs, and bloodlines carried forward for centuries after. woven so deeply into Europe that their influence outlasted the raids by nearly 1,000 years. So when you ask what made the Vikings nearly impossible to defeat, the honest answer isn't just longships or brutality or a fearless reputation. It was all of it moving together across more than 12 centuries, a people who could strike anywhere, adapt to anything, and never stayed still long enough for their enemies to catch up. Here's the part almost nobody mentions. Most of what we now picture as the pirate look was barely documented at the time. There are very few surviving portraits of real pirates wearing earrings.